Get on the ground now." Command Sergeant Major Elijah Carter had heard those words shouted at 18-year-olds crossing checkpoints in Kandahar province. He never expected to hear them shouted at him, at 58 years old, standing in his own front yard, with grass clippings stuck to his boots and a rake still warm in his hand. He set the rake down slowly. He raised his palms into the August air, and somewhere in the pocket of his faded work jeans, his thumb found the small silver coin he had carried every day for 31 years, and pressed against it, once, the way he always did when the ground under him stopped feeling steady. 3 patrol cars had turned onto Cedar Hollow Court 4 minutes earlier, lights spinning red and blue across manicured lawns that had never seen anything more dramatic than a stolen garden gnome. A neighbor had called 911 to report a large black man breaking into the biggest house on the street. Nobody on that street had bothered to ask a single question first, and in less than 5 minutes, the truth of who Elijah Carter really was would come roaring down that same quiet road in the back of a government limousine, carrying with it a reckoning that Cedar Hollow Court would talk about for years. But we are getting ahead of the story. Let's go back 6 months to the beginning, when nobody in the Thornberry Estates neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina, knew a single true thing about the quiet man who had bought the brick colonial at 2119 Cedar Hollow Court. Elijah had moved in on a gray Tuesday in February, driving a 15-year-old Ford F-150 with a dented tailgate, pulling a small U-Haul that carried, by his own count, 41 boxes and a single reclining chair. Neighbors watching from behind their blinds assumed the moving truck would come later, once he'd hired professionals to bring the real furniture. It never came. Elijah unloaded every box himself, stacking them in the garage with the same discipline he'd once used to organize supply lines for 400 soldiers at a forward operating base outside Kandahar. He was 58 years old, 6'2", built like a man who still ran 3 miles most mornings before the sun cleared the tree line. He had purchased the house, 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a half-acre lot. With savings built over 27 years of Army service, the kind of number that would have surprised every person on that street had they known it. $412,000. Paid in cash, no mortgage, no cosigner. Nothing anyone could question if they'd simply asked. Nobody asked. Instead, they watched. A retired insurance actuary 2 doors down, a heavyset man named Harold Bester, stood at his mailbox most mornings with a mug of coffee, squinting at Elijah mowing his own lawn instead of hiring the landscaping crew that serviced 6 of the 8 houses on the cul-de-sac. Something about him, Harold muttered to his wife one evening, unable to finish the sentence, because there was nothing to finish. There was only a man cutting grass on a Saturday. A young couple who'd moved in the spring before, Ryan and Beth Kowalski, crossed the street whenever they saw Elijah approaching on his morning walk. They offered stiff, closed-mouth nods instead of the easy hellos they gave every other neighbor. Elijah noticed. Of course he noticed. A man who had spent 3 decades reading the mood of a room before it turned dangerous did not miss suspicion aimed directly at his chest. He said nothing. He had learned that lesson long before the Army ever taught him anything. He had learned it as a 9-year-old boy in Gary, Indiana, watching a shop owner follow him up and down the cereal aisle because his mother, working a double shift at the laundromat 3 blocks away, had sent him in alone with exact change for a loaf of bread. He had learned it from his father, a man who served 2 decades in an Army uniform before a shattered hip forced him into early retirement, and who told his son, more times than either of them could count, that respect was never given to a black man for free. It had to be built, brick by brick, whether the world was watching or not. So Elijah built. He fixed his own gutters. He repaired his own fence. He shoveled the driveway of an 81-year-old widow 3 houses down before dawn every time it snowed, leaving before she woke up, so she wouldn't feel obligated to thank him. He kept a small, private study on the second floor of his home, a room he showed to almost no one, where photographs of young men and women in desert fatigues hung beside a modest wooden case holding 4 medals, one of them a silver star, earned for a mission he had never once discussed with a single soul on Cedar Hollow Court. And in his front pocket, every single day, he carried a small silver challenge coin, its edges worn smooth from 3 decades of his thumb running across the surface. It bore the crest of the 3rd Special Forces Group. It had been given to him by a 23-year-old private named Danny Okafor in a stretch of rock and dust outside Kandahar in 2009, on the night Elijah carried that same private 1,100 meters through gunfire after an ambush tore their convoy apart. Danny had pressed the coin into Elijah's palm 3 weeks later, in a hospital bed in Landstuhl, Germany, and said only, "You didn't leave me. I'm not letting you forget that you're the reason I get to go home." Elijah had carried it every day since. Watch for that coin. It matters more than anyone on Cedar Hollow Court will understand until the very end of this story. He never spoke about the Army unless someone asked directly, and even then his answers were short, almost apologetic, as if the subject embarrassed him. Most of his neighbors simply decided, without evidence, that he must work some ordinary job downtown. Logistics, maybe, or maintenance, since he drove an unremarkable truck and dressed like a man who did his own yard work. None of them knew that the folded American flag in his garage had once flown over a base he commanded through some of the most dangerous 18 months of the entire Afghan campaign. He kept it there, out of sight, not from shame, but from the same instinct that made him shovel driveways before dawn. To Elijah, dignity was never something you displayed for an audience. It was something you carried quietly, the same way he carried his duty, and the same way he carried that coin. He had hoped, moving into a place like Thornbury Estates, that maybe this chapter of his life would be different. That a man in his late 50s with a well-kept lawn and a peaceful, disciplined routine might finally be judged by what he did, instead of how he looked doing it. He never said this out loud to anyone. He simply kept mowing, kept waving at neighbors who wouldn't wave back, and told himself this was a test he had passed 100 times before, in 100 different uniforms. But there was one person on that street whose suspicion ran deeper than stiff nods and sideways glances, and her name was Margaret Coulson. Margaret was 52 years old, a real estate agent with a corner office at Whitfield and Pierce Realty downtown. And, more importantly to this story, she was the president of the Thornbury Estates Homeowners Association, a position she had held for 6 years and defended with the ferocity of a woman guarding something far more personal than a subdivision. Margaret believed, with total and unshakable sincerity, that she was the last line of defense protecting the character. She used that word constantly, character, of a neighborhood she had watched change over the past decade. She said this to her husband at dinner. She said it in HOA meetings, dressed up in language about maintaining property values and community standards. She never once, not to herself, not to anyone, called it what it actually was. Margaret had lived across the street from Elijah for 6 months by the time this story reaches its breaking point, and in that entire time, she had spoken to him exactly once, a brief, chilly exchange at her own housewarming party, where Elijah had politely declined her invitation to stay for cake, preferring to get back to unpacking. Margaret had taken that small, ordinary refusal and built an entire narrative around it. In the weeks that followed, she watched him through her kitchen window with a kind of obsessive attention she would never have admitted to, cataloging every detail that fit the story she'd already decided was true. A large man in worn clothing, moving with total confidence around a house she had privately decided was too grand for someone like him. She never once considered the simplest explanation. She never once considered asking. On a bright Saturday morning in August the 11th at 9:14 a.m., according to the police dispatch log that would later become public record, Margaret Coulson stood at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, watching Elijah wheel his mower out of the garage. He was dressed exactly as he was every single Saturday, a faded gray t-shirt gone soft at the collar, grass-stained work boots, a ball cap pulled low against the sun. Margaret set down her coffee. She picked up her phone, and she dialed 911. She described, in a voice trembling with what she would later insist to herself was genuine concern, a large black male in worn clothing attempting to gain access to a house that did not appear to belong to him. She mentioned, unprompted, that he had opened the garage with what looked like a stolen remote. She never once used the word neighbor. She used the word suspect 4 times in a 90-second call. When the dispatcher asked if she'd seen any actual evidence of a break-in, a broken window, a forced door, Margaret paused only a moment before saying that his behavior just didn't look right for that house. She hung up the phone feeling, in her own words, later that day, like she had simply done her civic duty. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. The first patrol car turned onto Cedar Hollow Court within 6 minutes. Officer Todd Brennan arrived first, a 31-year-old patrolman with 4 years on the Charlotte-Mecklenburg force, followed within 90 seconds by 2 more cruisers, lights washing red and blue, across a street that had never needed them before. Neighbors began stepping out onto their porches. Ryan and Beth Kowalski stood frozen at their own front door. Harold Bester came out to his mailbox with his coffee mug, still in hand, watching with the same squint he always aimed at Elijah, except now it had an audience. Officer Brennan approached with his hand resting near his belt, ordering Elijah to raise his hands where they could be seen. And Elijah, a man who had once talked 18-year-old privates through the worst 30 seconds of their lives without raising his voice, complied instantly. He set down his rake. He lifted his palms. He spoke in the same calm, level tone he had used to steady frightened soldiers under fire, and told the officers plainly that this was his home, that he had owned it for over 2 years, that his name was Elijah Carter. The officers exchanged skeptical glances. It didn't fit the picture already forming in their minds, a picture shaped less by anything Elijah had done, and more by 90 seconds of a frightened phone call. Why is a homeowner dressed like that? One of the newer officers asked, looking Elijah up and down with open doubt. I was cutting my own grass, Elijah said, and offered a small, patient smile. The way I do every Saturday of the year. Watch her. Because this is the moment her whole career on this street begins to unravel, though she doesn't know it yet. A rookie officer named Naomi Reyes, 26 years old, 7 months on the job, stood slightly apart from the others, studying Elijah with an attention the veterans on scene weren't giving him. She noticed the way he held his weight, evenly, without shifting. She noticed his hands were steady, not shaking, not clenched. The hands of a man who had been trained, not the hands of a man caught doing something wrong. She stepped toward her sergeant. Sir, she said quietly, can we slow this down? Verify the address before we do anything else. Sergeant Grant Holloway, 51 years old, 19 years on the force, waved her off without looking at her. People who break into houses always got a smooth story ready, Reyes. Watch and learn. Elijah reached slowly into his pocket, moving with the deliberate care of a man who understood exactly how a sudden motion could get him killed, and produced his keys, his wallet, his driver's license, and the folded deed to the property. He held them out, his hands steady, his face unreadable, the same unreadable face he had once worn through briefings where the wrong decision meant men didn't come home. Sergeant Holloway barely glanced at the documents. He was more interested in the crowd gathering across the street than the proof standing directly in front of him. Elijah pressed the small remote, clipped to his belt loop. The garage door rose smoothly, revealing a neatly organized workspace, a workbench, tools hung in careful rows, and the folded flag he kept out of sight. Instead of accepting this as the obvious evidence it was, one of the officers suggested out loud that the remote could have been stolen along with the keys. Nobody laughed at how little sense that made. Nobody needed it to make sense. The suspicion in the air had its own momentum now. Margaret Coulson stood on her own porch, arms crossed, and called out, loud enough for the whole street to hear, that she was certain this man could not possibly be the owner of a house like that. Her voice carried the total, unshakable confidence of a woman who had convinced herself that her instincts were a form of evidence. Several neighbors nodded along. Harold Bester murmured something in agreement. The whispered consensus rippled down the sidewalk like a current finding the path of least resistance. Elijah stood through all of it in silence, watching the scene unfold with the detached patience of a man who had survived things far worse than public suspicion, and who had long ago learned which battles were worth fighting in the moment and which ones would only get him hurt for trying. Sergeant Halloway had heard enough. With a short final nod to his officers, he ordered Elijah to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The cuffs closed around Elijah's wrists with a sharp metallic click that seemed to echo down the entire quiet street. For the space of one breath, something flickered across his face, something he did not let anyone see finish forming before it settled back into stillness. He did not resist. He did not pull away. He did not give them a single reason to escalate, because he understood, with a clarity that came from a lifetime of practice, that resistance would only make things worse for a man who looked like him. No matter what medals were hanging in a room upstairs, that none of these officers would ever see. More neighbors stepped out to watch. Phones rose into the air. A large black man, restrained in handcuffs, on the steps of his own front porch at 9:23 on a Saturday morning, was about to become the most recorded thing that had ever happened on Cedar Hollow Court. Now, hold on to that image for a moment, because I need you to understand exactly how far this was about to go before help arrived. What happened over the next 40 minutes was not a misunderstanding that resolved itself quickly. It got worse. 3 separate times, it got worse. The first came almost immediately. Elijah was guided down onto the top step of his own porch, the cuffs biting into his wrists as he sat beneath the gathered stares of neighbors who had turned his front lawn into something closer to a public trial than a Saturday morning. A man from across the street, someone Elijah had never even met, called out something mocking about people who pretend to own things that aren't theirs. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through part of the crowd. Elijah kept his eyes forward, his spine straight, even while seated, refusing to let the cuffs or the whispers bend a posture he had carried through decades of far greater trials. The second escalation came from Sergeant Halloway, himself perhaps testing him, perhaps simply filling the silence. "What do you do for a living?" he asked. "I'm retired," Elijah said. "Retired from what?" "The military. 27 years. One of the younger officers let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Everybody claims they served when it's convenient." Elijah did not correct him. He did not raise his voice. He simply sat there, cuffed, absorbing an insult that struck far deeper than any of them realized, given the decades of genuine sacrifice behind the 4 plain words he had just spoken. He pressed his thumb, awkwardly, against the outside of his jeans pocket, feeling the small, hard shape of the coin through the denim, the only movement he allowed himself. The third escalation was the cruelest, and it came from Margaret Coulson. She had drifted closer to the small crowd gathered at the edge of Elijah's lawn, and when a neighbor asked whether the police had actually confirmed his story yet, Margaret spoke loud enough for Elijah to hear every word. "I don't care what papers he's got," she said. "People steal deeds. People steal identities. I've sold real estate in this city for 11 years. I know when something doesn't add up, and this doesn't add up." She said it with the flat, unshakable certainty of a woman testifying under oath, and several neighbors nodded along again. Because it is a strange thing about crowds. Once suspicion finds a confident enough voice, other people mistake that confidence for proof. Elijah heard every word. He did not look at her. He looked instead at a point somewhere past the crowd, at the tree line at the edge of his property, and he breathed, slow and even, the way he had once taught frightened young soldiers to breathe when the noise around them threatened to become the only thing they could hear. This is the moment I want you to notice, because it's the quiet turning point of the entire story. Officer Naomi Reyes stood at the edge of the group, watching Margaret Colson's certainty ripple through the crowd, and something in her chest went cold and tight. She had joined the force 9 months earlier because her own grandfather, a black man who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, had told her stories about being pulled over in his own driveway in 3 different decades of his life. She was watching those stories happen in real time, on a sunny Saturday morning, and she was the only person in a uniform doing nothing to stop it. She stepped toward Sergeant Halloway one more time. "Sir, we should pull the property records, right now, before this goes any further." "We will," Halloway said, not moving. "When I decide we need to." Naomi Reyes said nothing else, but she pulled out her own phone, and quietly, without announcing it to anyone, she began searching the county property database herself. It would take her 6 more minutes to find what she was looking for. Those 6 minutes were about to become the longest of Margaret Colson's life. Though not for the reason Margaret expected. Because at 9:31 a.m., the low rumble of a heavier engine reached the street, distinct from the idling patrol cars parked at the curb. Heads turned. A dark, unmarked government SUV rounded the corner of Cedar Hollow Court, moving with an unhurried, deliberate authority that felt instantly out of place among the ordinary suburban houses. It slowed as it approached the gathered crowd. Several of the officers on scene exchanged uncertain glances. Elijah, still seated on the step with his wrists bound behind him, lifted his head slightly at the sound. Something flickered behind his otherwise unreadable eyes, not fear this time, but recognition. The crowd went quiet as the SUV came to a full stop directly in front of the house. Nobody on that street yet understood how much the next few minutes were about to change everything they thought they knew. The rear door opened and a broad-shouldered man in a colonel's uniform stepped out onto the pavement. His posture alone made the police officers straighten instinctively. Some old, deep-wired reflex to rank that outlasted whatever confidence had carried them through the morning. His eyes swept the scene, the patrol cars, the crowd, and finally Elijah, seated in handcuffs on the steps of his own home. Whatever composure Colonel David Ames had carried out of that vehicle vanished, the moment recognition crossed his face. He strode forward without hesitation, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd. "Who gave the order to restrain this man?" The officers stammered. Nobody wanted to claim it. Margaret Colson felt something cold settle low in her stomach, a first small crack in the certainty she had been standing on all morning. Before anyone could answer the colonel's question, a second engine rolled down the street. Low, deep, unhurried, and every head turned again. This time, it was a long black limousine bearing military plates, moving with the slow, deliberate weight of a vehicle that had never once belonged on an ordinary residential street on an ordinary Saturday morning. It stopped directly behind the SUV. Its presence alone silenced even the last scattered whispers among the crowd. Colonel Ames turned toward it and snapped into something even more rigid than before. The entire street seemed to hold its breath as the limousine's rear door opened. A tall man stepped out, and the 4 silver stars on his uniform caught the morning light with an effect that was immediate and total. Every officer on scene straightened. Colonel Ames's hand rose into a crisp salute, so fast it startled the watching neighbors. The man walking toward them was General Thomas Reeve, Commanding General, United States Army Special Operations Command. And he did not look at the officers, did not glance at the gathered crowd, did not pause to survey the scene the way anyone else might have. His eyes were fixed entirely on Elijah, seated in handcuffs on the steps of his own home. He crossed the lawn with long, purposeful strides that carried an urgency nobody on that street had ever seen aimed at another human being. Sergeant Grant Holloway felt his stomach twist as he watched. 19 years on the force, and he had never once doubted his own instincts fast enough to matter. Now, watching a 4-star general move across a suburban lawn, with that kind of urgency toward the man he had personally ordered cuffed an hour earlier, he began to understand, with sickening clarity, exactly how badly he had misjudged this morning. He glanced at Officer Reyes and found he could not meet her eyes. For the first time since the patrol cars arrived, the street went completely, utterly silent. Freeze that moment with me for a second. No engines, no whispers, no phones clicking. Just the sound of General Reeve's boots on the grass, and 41 people who had spent the last hour so certain of what they were looking at, now realizing they understood nothing at all. The general knelt down in front of Elijah, bringing himself to eye level with the seated man. When he spoke, his voice was low and thick with something that sounded almost like grief. I'm sorry it took me this long to get here, Sergeant Major. He said it like an apology to an old friend, because that is exactly what it was. Elijah nodded once, the way old friends acknowledge each other, without needing many words to bridge the years between them. General Reeve turned his head sharply toward the nearest officer. Get those cuffs off him now. Hands fumbled with the key. The metal fell away from Elijah's wrists with a small clatter that sounded impossibly loud in the stunned silence. The entire atmosphere on Cedar Hollow Court shifted in that instant, from suspicion and judgment to something closer to disbelief, and, in more than a few faces, quiet shame. As Elijah rubbed his freed wrists, General Reeve remained kneeling beside him, seemingly unconcerned with the growing crowd now watching in open astonishment. He began speaking, not just to Elijah, but loud enough for the whole street to hear. He told them that the man sitting on that porch step had once commanded some of the most dangerous special operations missions of the entire Afghan campaign. Missions that had brought home soldiers who otherwise never would have made it back to their families. He told them Elijah had turned down 3 separate promotions to a desk in the Pentagon, choosing every time to stay with his unit, closer to the danger, rather than accept a safer post further from the front lines. He described the silver star hanging in a study upstairs that none of them had ever seen, earned for an act of courage Elijah had never once mentioned to a single soul on this street. And then he told them about the night that mattered most. March of 2009, General Reeve said, his voice catching slightly. A convoy under my command was ambushed in the mountains outside Kandahar. I was a captain then, 26 years old, and I genuinely believed we weren't getting out of that valley alive. It was Sergeant Major Carter who led a small team through 6 hours of gunfire to bring every wounded soldier out. 3 men are alive today, including me, because of decisions he made that night that could just as easily have cost him his own life instead. Somewhere in that crowd, a phone camera kept recording, but nobody was thinking about footage anymore. Margaret Coulson stood frozen at the edge of the group, her earlier certainty crumbling into something hot and unbearable, rising in her chest. Around her, the officers who had cuffed Elijah less than an hour before stood absolutely still, beginning to grasp the full weight of what they had done. But General Reeve wasn't finished. And this is the second reveal of the story, because a mission report and a general's word were enough for most people on that street, but Margaret Coulson, even now, was not most people. I don't care who you are, Margaret said suddenly, her voice cracking through the stunned quiet. That still doesn't explain why he was dressed like. She stopped herself, but everyone heard exactly what she didn't say. General Reeve turned toward her, slow and deliberate, and for the first time all morning, his voice went hard. "Ma'am, this man has a silver star, a bronze star with valor, and 27 years of honorable service, and you called the police on him for cutting his own grass. I'd suggest you think very carefully about your next sentence." Margaret said nothing else. But she would think about that moment for the rest of her life, and not because she wanted to. Colonel Ames stepped forward next, holding out a tablet. On the screen was a scanned copy of the property deed for 2T119 Cedar Hollow Court, pulled directly from the Mecklenburg County Recorder's office at Officer Reyes's request 6 minutes earlier. The same 6 minutes she had spent quietly working while Sergeant Halloway told her to wait. The deed showed Elijah Carter as sole owner of record, purchase date February 3rd, over 2 years old. No liens, no irregularities, paid in full. It was the third confirmation of a truth that had needed no confirmation at all. Elijah had told them himself, at 9:16 that morning, before any of this had happened. Nobody had believed him then. They believed a tablet now. Sergeant Halloway stepped forward, his face pale under the midday sun. "Sir, General, I take full responsibility for the decision to detain." "You'll get your chance to explain that to Internal Affairs," General Reeve said, not unkindly, but with total finality. "Right now, I'd like a moment with Sergeant Major Carter." The crowd began to disperse in pieces. In the awkward, shamefaced way, crowds disperse when they realize they were never spectators at all. They were participants. Harold Bester quietly went back inside without a word to anyone. Ryan and Beth Kowalski stood frozen a moment longer before retreating to their own porch, unable to look at Elijah directly. Margaret Coulson did not move. She stood on the sidewalk, arms no longer crossed, watching a scene that had, in the space of 11 minutes, completely dismantled every assumption she had built her entire morning, and, quietly, much of her adult life, around. That was only the beginning of what she would lose. Within 24 hours, the video, filmed by 3 separate neighbors, uploaded and shared over 4,000 times before noon the next day, had made its way to local news. Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department opened a formal internal affairs investigation before the sun set that same evening. Investigators pulled security footage from a camera 2 houses down, angled toward the road, which confirmed Elijah had driven into his own driveway at 6:52 that morning, exactly as he did every single day, and had never once left the property before officers arrived. County records confirmed ownership dating back 2 years and 4 months. No irregularities of any kind. The original 911 call was reviewed line by line, and investigators noted, pointedly, in the official report, that the caller had described a man engaged in no suspicious behavior whatsoever beyond existing in a house she did not believe he could afford. Sergeant Grant Halloway was placed on unpaid administrative leave within 72 hours. 2 weeks later, following the internal affairs findings, he was formally demoted and permanently reassigned away from any patrol supervisory role. A quiet but total collapse of 19 years of career momentum, brought down by his own refusal, in the moment that mattered most, to simply slow down and check. He never publicly apologized. In his written statement to Internal Affairs, he maintained that he had followed standard procedure based on the information available at the time. He was still saying it, almost word for word, 8 months later, to a reporter who caught him outside a grocery store. Some people, it turns out, would rather lose everything than admit they were wrong, even once. Officer Todd Brennan received a written reprimand and was required to complete 16 hours of de-escalation retraining. Officer Naomi Reyes received something different entirely. 3 weeks after the incident, the department's newly formed Community Trust Review Board created directly in response to what happened on Cedar Hollow Court, cited her instinct to slow the situation down and independently verify the property records as the single action that prevented further escalation of an already unjustified detainment. She was promoted to field training officer 11 months later, the youngest in the department's history, and would go on to help rewrite 3 sections of the department's stop and detain protocol, sections that now bear an informal nickname among her colleagues, the Cedar Hollow Standard. But it was Margaret Colson whose reckoning ran the deepest, and it did not happen all at once. It happened the way real consequences usually happen, slowly in pieces, each one a little harder to ignore than the last. The video reached her real estate brokerage within 36 hours. Whitfield and Pierce Realty issued a statement distancing the firm from her personal conduct, and within a month, Margaret had lost 4 active client relationships and 2 pending listings. Families who told her broker plainly that they no longer wanted her representing them. Her name was recognized now, but not for the reason a real estate agent wants to be recognized for. The Thornbury Estates Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting 14 days after the incident. Margaret stood at the front of the same community room where she had chaired 6 years of meetings about mailbox colors and holiday decoration policies, and she tried, one last time, to explain herself. She told the room she had genuinely believed she was protecting the neighborhood. She said the word instinct 3 times. She said she was sorry people were upset, but stopped short. Everyone in that room noticed she stopped short of saying she was sorry for what she had actually done. The board removed her from the presidency by a vote of 11-1. The one vote in her favor was her own. 2 months after that, the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office reviewed the case for a possible charge of filing a false police report. Ultimately, no criminal charge was filed. Investigators concluded, in a decision that frustrated a great many people who had watched the video, that Margaret's call, however baseless and however devastating in its consequences, technically fell within the boundaries of a citizen's right to report suspected criminal activity. But the civil consequences were only beginning. 3 months after the incident, Elijah Carter, who had spent decades avoiding attention of every kind, filed a civil complaint against Margaret Colson for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He did not want money for himself. He said so, plainly, in a short statement his attorney read outside the courthouse. He wanted the settlement, whatever it turned out to be, directed to a scholarship fund for children of fallen and wounded Special Operations soldiers. Margaret Colson settled out of court 4 months later for an amount neither side would publicly disclose, though local reporting placed it near $90,000, a number that emptied a retirement account she and her husband had built over 11 years. It was not the money that finally broke through to her, though. It was something smaller, and it happened on a rainy Tuesday evening in October, 2 months after the settlement, when Margaret Colson, no longer HOA president, no longer welcome at 3 of the 4 dinner parties she used to host every year, sat alone in her kitchen and watched the video of that Saturday morning one more time. She had watched it a dozen times already, always looking for the moment that would let her feel, even a little, that she had been reasonable. This time, for the first time, she watched Elijah's face instead of her own voice in the recording. She watched him sit in handcuffs on his own porch step, spine straight, saying nothing, absorbing an insult about his own service that she had helped set into motion. And for the first time since that morning in August, Margaret Colson put her head down on her kitchen table and cried, not for herself, not for the money, not for the presidency she'd lost, but because she finally fully understood exactly what she had done to a man who had never once done anything to her at all. 3 weeks later, she wrote Elijah a letter, not an email. A letter in her own handwriting, 4 pages long, that she carried to his mailbox herself and did not sign with any explanation attached. She simply left it the way he had once left a snow shovel's worth of silent kindness on a widow's driveway. In it, she admitted, in full, without qualifying language, without the word instinct anywhere in the 4 pages, that she had decided who he was before she ever spoke a real word to him, and that the reason had nothing to do with property values and everything to do with a fear she had never once had the courage to examine in herself until it cost her everything she thought she valued. She asked for nothing in return. She said she understood if he never wanted to see her again. Elijah read the letter once, standing at his own mailbox in the October evening light. He did not go across the street, but 6 weeks later, when the Thornbury Estates Community Board organized a small evening gathering to formally apologize to him. An event Elijah agreed to attend only after being asked 3 separate times. Margaret Coulson stood quietly in the back of the room, and when it ended, she was the last person to leave. And the first person, the following spring, to volunteer, unasked, for the neighborhood's new community outreach committee, the one that now runs an annual scholarship dinner in Elijah's honor, a dinner she has helped organize, without complaint and without credit, for 3 years running. Now let me take you forward 6 months, past the news cameras, past the internal affairs reports, past the settlement and the letter, and the quiet gathering in the community room, to a Saturday morning in February. 1 year, almost to the day, since Elijah Carter first drove his dented Ford pickup into the driveway at 2119 Cedar Hollow Court. He is outside, of course. Some things do not change. He is 59 now, and the flag in his garage is still folded, still out of sight, still not something he displays for anyone to see. He still keeps the silver challenge coin in his front pocket, and sometimes, in the quiet middle of an ordinary afternoon, his thumb still finds its worn edge without him meaning it to. The neighborhood around him has changed in ways smaller than at the headline, but larger than most people would guess. Harold Bester waves now. A real wave, not the stiff nod of before, and has, twice this winter, brought his own thermos of coffee out to the curb just to talk about nothing much at all. Ryan and Beth Kowalski invited Elijah to their daughter's first birthday party in November. He came for 20 minutes, brought a small toy soldier he'd kept since his own son was born, and left before the cake, the way he always does, quietly, without needing to be thanked. Officer Naomi Reyes still stops by sometimes, off duty in her own car, just to check in. She calls him Sergeant Major, and he has never once corrected her. And on this particular February morning, as Elijah steps out onto his porch with a mug of coffee, he sees Margaret Coulson across the street, kneeling in her own garden bed, planting something early for the spring. She looks up when she hears his door. For a moment, neither of them says anything at all. That same kind of frozen, weighted silence that hung over the whole street on that terrible Saturday a year ago, except this time it means something entirely different. She raises her hand. First, he raises his in return. No words pass between them. None are needed. He goes back inside for his rake. Because there are leaves on the lawn even in February, and because a man like Elijah Carter has never once needed applause to know the value of quiet, disciplined work, done the same way, every single Saturday, no matter who is watching. In his pocket, the coin sits exactly where it always sits. A small, worn piece of silver that has outlasted an ambush, a career, a false accusation, and an entire year of a street relearning how to see him. It asks for nothing. It never has. But in the end, it always finds a way to be seen. If this story moved you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognize someone in it, maybe even yourself, take a second and hit like, so it reaches someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who's ever been judged before they were ever truly seen. And tell me in the comments, have you ever stood in that crowd, watching something wrong happen, and had to decide whether to stay quiet or step forward. I read every single one,